All right, Daniel, welcome back to the Metagame. I think the last time I spoke to you was like over 2 years ago. And I went back to that episode just to remind myself what we talked about, but I didn't want to listen to it so that it wouldn't corrupt my thinking today or whatever. But we opened up talking about commitment and how you had trapped yourself at the monastic academy for I think a total of 5 years doing like residential training or something. And you were telling the listeners about that. And yeah, that was actually one of my favorite episodes. But it's really good to have you back. I'm curious, I guess like on that, 5 years of residential training at the monastic academy. I think I read somewhere that you did 2 years of cumulative silent retreat. So you've been really like practicing. I bet there's many things you could say about that, but what has surprised you the most about that journey?
Well, first I'll say, thank you for having me back on the show. This podcast has become one of my favorites in the space. I don't listen to podcasts very much anymore, and I find myself reliably listening to your conversation. So it's an honor to be here with you.
That means a lot.
And it's funny, what comes to mind is actually that much of the transformation that I experienced in my now 20 years of practice, and some portion of that more intensive practice, was in the last 3 years. And that there were certain pieces that I didn't get prior to that I think fundamentally retarded my process. And so, that's what I'm surprised that I got it wrong for so long. Maybe that's the
So what were some of these pieces that you discovered in the last 3 years?
Oh, it's very specific. So this is something that I received from the Aletheia unfolding method.
Steve March's work.
Yeah, Steve March's work. And it's where it starts. And frankly, Steve, if you're listening, I'm sorry that I'm saying this, but you get 80% of the potency of the work in the first two lessons and of the first level. And one of the very, very first pieces is on the poetic attunement. And the poetic attunement is that we do this practice, in this case, Aletheia, but I would argue actually any real transformational work, we do it out of a love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake, not to fix, change, improve, anything at all. And I spent a long time trying to fix, change, and improve my mind, and therefore completely getting in the way of my own process and transformation.
Yeah, maybe we'll sharpen that up a bit for the listeners. It's like, maybe describe personal development in that paradigm where you're doing things to fix versus you're doing it for truth, beauty, and goodness for its own sake.
Yeah. So the self-improvement paradigm is what Steve usually compares the self-unfoldment paradigm to. And self-improvement is, basically relating to yourself as an object that needs to improve along certain dimensions. And so you and there's good parts of this, like skill building and certain kinds of training. It makes a lot of sense to improve in a very specific way, in the way, like a linear way, where you look at a problem and you fix it. And there is a way that parts of the world work like this, but in fact, I would say the soul and the human heart and the human being does not respond well to that kind of relationship. And so it's clarifying the essence of how it is that we become. And it's not through endeavoring to fix or upgrade ourselves, actually. That's a symptom of exactly that which is constraining our becoming.
I'm searching for a metaphor for this, but I'm getting the sense of almost like the Chinese finger trap, where the more you do the thing that you're trying to do, ostensibly to be free from the trap, the more you're tightening it. And I think having the attitude that you are broken, or having the attitude that you need to fix yourself, always presupposes that you're broken. Even as you make progress on that, that structure kind of follows you along.
Well said. Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. So
what I'm hearing is that you discovered this more recently in the last few years. And so I don't know if it's fair to assume, but does this mean that a lot of your practice before came with this like striving mentality, and then something shifted?
Yeah. Striving and really attempting to compensate for pain that I didn't want to feel, right? That was kind of moving me and generating my conscious practice. And yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, okay, there's a million questions that just popped in my head at the same time. And I think maybe like an anchor to start with, because I think a bunch of things are going to be like spokes on this like one node. Has to do with, I'll just say, like love and secure attachment. And I think the place where I'd like to start this conversation is the first of your 2025 posts on your Substack, called The Intimate Mirror. And the first post is, I think the title here is Spirituality is Secure Attachment with Reality. I've heard this statement come up in different contexts from different people. I think you attribute it to John Churchill saying something about cosmic secure attachment. And I think this is going to be the generator for all the other things I want to talk to you about. So maybe you can we'll start with like, what does this mean exactly? Why is spirituality a secure attachment with reality?
Yeah. So this is, I think, a useful way of looking, because what I've found in my own work, my own practice, and in working with people in their transformation, we set up the space where we are practicing out of a love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake. And what that actually effectively does, if we set up the space right, is evoke all in us that isn't comfortable with that clarity of space and intention. And so what comes up is actually the parts of us that don't feel safe simply loving what's true. And then with each of those structures, each of those movements of reality that kind of are evoked by the clarity of intention, you meet in such a way that they kind of feel comfortable revealing their wisdom, revealing their pain. And then that sort of melts us into a deeper sense of safety, and then you feel more comfortable over time, just lingering, trusting the love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake as a kind of fundamental attitude that you can live your life from. And that love of goodness, truth, and beauty is a love of reality. You could also say it's the love of God. And it like, you can trust that, but we don't trust that for reasons, all kinds of reasons. And working those reasons out is the spiritual path, like following that motivational infrastructure in your interior down into the roots so that you see what it's really made of, is the path, as I understand it. And so that movement over time is a movement towards more and more secure, we might say, secure attachment with reality.
Yeah, and if I can tie this into what we were saying about the fixing mentality, is that an insecure attachment to reality? It's like, oh, I got to fix something, like, or an anxious attachment to reality?
Yeah, exactly. And there's these typings like avoidant and anxious, but actually everybody's intimacy disorder is pretty unique. Like there's, so that's why one-on-one transformational work is so potent, is that like it is people's minds and the way that they fail to trust reality is very specific.
This reminds me of a quote I heard you say, which I'm gonna, let me see if I can find. Yeah. So Alan Watts had this quote that I really liked, which was, once you get the message, put down the phone, which I think referred to psychedelic experiences. Like, once you get all the insights, stop taking acid, start integrating those insights. And I heard you add like a part 2 to this, which is, it's like, okay, once you get the message, put down the phone, and then do the work to liberate the natural intelligence that guides your life and reveals the purpose of your soul. And so if we trust reality, then I think we increase our bandwidth to that natural intelligence that guides our life and reveals the purpose of our soul. When I hear this, it's very promising and exciting, but how do I do that? I know it's going to be very particular, but maybe just to give some examples, to give people a taste of it, do the work to liberate this natural intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, this is why there are paths, right? It's a complex situation we find ourselves in. The network of delusion and the justification system is complicated. Mm-hmm. And so what works for any individual mind is actually, there's not just one response.
Right.
That being said, finding a way to come into like a tuned relationship in and through the heart, essentially, we might say, with the structures of your interior will melt them in such a way that they reveal their natural intelligence, their living intelligence. But that, like, that's not very practical for a lot of people, what I just said. It's more practical than I think a lot of spiritual instructions tend to be, but it's ultimately like, if you don't know what attunement is, if you don't know what love is, if you don't know how to liberate the intelligence of the heart in relationship so that it can function, if you don't know how to love truth, like actually, meaning like you don't know how to do that, then all the things I'm saying can't ground into your phenomenology, and then, good luck.
Yeah. You have to somehow evoke the first person experience of like loving truth, beauty and goodness for its own sake.
Exactly. And part of what I think is part of like the larger opportunity ahead of us as we kind of transition planetary culture is to collapse the distinction between ontology and phenomenology. Right. So when I say these words, more and more we have a culture that understands what love is. Or it's not just a word floating out there in like cultural space that is under attack from a bunch of different directions, but it means something, or like attunement. Like, we know what that means in our direct experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of these words also, they have very different reference in different minds of, people from different subcultures and stuff like that. Like exactly. There's this rationalist concept called inferential distance, which is like how many concepts do I need to explain to you to explain the one concept I initially wanted to talk to you about? Let's say, it's like love or something. It's like, how far apart are we before we get to the thing that I'm trying to say? And often, actually this happened recently, I found myself in a space where I was having disagreements, kind of political disagreements with people, that I realized it would probably take like 1.5 hours of conversation before I could even explain the disagreement. Because if I just went straight to the disagreement, they would think I'm meaning something totally different by the words that I use. And I couldn't actually find other words to use that wouldn't trigger their philosophical allergies and all this stuff. And so, yeah, everyone's sense of these words are fractionated.
Right. And my sense is that that's why we need to create spiritual traditions that have very sophisticated understandings of like the sort of interior mimetic networks that generate understanding in order to produce paths that can meet our kind of postmodern, decohered, fragmented cultural circumstances. Because it's true what you say, and it's a real issue in terms of creating coherent culture.
Yeah. I wonder if we could maybe give people a taste for one of these things. So I suspect, or I hope, that most people have had some experience with love, whether or not they like label it that way. And love seems to be kind of the fundamental thing underneath all of this. So we'll get to this, but having a secure attachment with reality, if I keep importing from the psychological notion of secure attachment, that whole conversation has to do with love. So do you have any prompts or any like examples or anything that could maybe give someone the first person experience, or just a percentage point of the first person experience of love, so at least they know what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful question. I don't know that I have a good response. What comes is just noticing how it is that everything that you experience is welcomed by reality. It is, whether you want it to be or not. And the way that you don't want your own experience to be welcomed is a kind of failure of love. But reality itself is welcoming all of it. Check it out.
So I'll just tell you my reaction to this because this could be interesting. On its own, that feels impersonal, right? Like reality, reality allows for everything, but it kind of, at least the way I feel about it, is it's kind of mechanistically doing that in a way that feels impersonal. I have to import some religious language, like maybe God, or like the Christian God or something. But reality on its own has this impersonal quality to it, which it might just be my experience. But what would you say to that?
I agree. I actually think that I don't know how to open up in the direction of the kind of warmth of intimacy that I'm pointing to when I say something like everything is being welcomed by reality, without appealing to things like God or divinity or sacred world. But a lot of, to our earlier point, a lot of people have extreme allergic responses and religious trauma that prevents them from hearing those invitations.
Yeah. I think you hit one of the key problems with this. An idea that occurred to me is images were flashing in my mind of little tastes of love, and I think one of them is the love that it is for whatever reason easier to access for a child. Like if a child does something annoying, for whatever reason, it's easier to be patient than if like an adult did the same annoying thing.
Yeah.
And that I can actually use that in reverse, where sometimes I'll and I mean this in the least patronizing way possible, but I'll treat my adult friends like their children in these moments because it gives me more capacity to love.
Oh, that's a much better thing that I said. Yeah, exactly. Well said. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And I would just suggest that perhaps reality is holding us in that same way, or we can experience reality holding us in that exact same way. So you can kind of do that, that's exact switch that you're mentioning. So you can see like how it is that you tenderly, lovingly hold the spontaneous life of a child, and then find a way to hold yourself that way, your friends that way, and then even have the experience of like life holding you with that same kind of tender, welcoming love.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so let's come back to this secure attachment thing. Am I right in assuming that it's more than a metaphor? Like it's perhaps something about our experience with love and intimacy with our biological parents carries over to the way we relate to reality?
Yeah,
and
that's
so,
my sense. Yeah.
So it's almost like attachment style is upstream of like almost everything. Like it's like the lens that we perceive everything else through.
That's my sense. And I think that you can read, so a lot of the framing, is informed by John Churchill's work. But he was a student of Daniel P. Brown, who was this incredible teacher, now passed away, who wrote the book on attachment disturbances in adults and created the ideal parent figure protocol, which is probably the most effective method of securing the attachment system that I've found. And it I think he makes a very persuasive case that basically the internal working model, which is the kind of like interior attachment environment, like is generative of the whole world model and whole experience of the life. And so if that is disordered, and it tends to disorder according to like avoidant and anxious ways, like those are the kind of one way of typing out the basic patterns, the way that it gets disordered. But if it's disordered, then yeah, like 1,000 flowers of disorder bloom, right? Like narcissism, borderline, like all the various psychological disorders, I believe increasingly are generated by insecure attachment system.
For the purposes of like your conception of it, how do you type this stuff? Like I know you said it's way more specific to the person than maybe avoidant and anxious, but for the sake of this discussion, how would you type it?
Yeah, I don't really do typing in that way. I know some practitioners do, but I don't. I do often work with like mother and father wounds. So I render it like that because I agree with you in terms of like, yeah, our mother and father, the way they held us kind of created this initial template that then informs the way that we relate to reality and our own interior or whatever. And so there's a way that the relationship with the mother, for instance, is just a kind of keystone generative relationship within the internal working model and thus within like the generative structure of the whole mind.
Yeah, so maybe let's go through each of these because I have a quote here where you said the mother wound, when you were talking about the mother wound, you said she's her first experience of relationship, of being held, of existing in the world. Through her, we learn whether it's safe to be ourselves, whether our needs deserve to be met, and whether we are fundamentally welcome in existence.
Exactly.
Beautifully written. And also it just feels it's very true. Like even just thinking about it, this is something that every single human being has an experience with by virtue of being born from a mother. Maybe the father wasn't there, but there's always a mother.
Yes.
And so, what would you say are what are the hallmarks of the mother wound?
Shame seems to be the leading indicator that I've found. So wherever there's shame in the system, that usually indicates some portion of the interior of the psyche that wasn't allowed within the relationship with the mother, and so became kind of cut off and fragmented. And then that generates and degenerates into all kinds of different compensation structures. But shame is the kind of indication that there's some kind of failure of love in that relationship.
And so it's like you didn't experience unconditional acceptance from your mom. And then that becomes a pattern for how you might relate to parts of yourself that you no longer unconditionally accept.
You internalize that. Yeah, exactly. So the way that your parents held you tends to be like the same shape as the way that you hold your interior, your parts, your somatic experience, your whatever it is that arises in your life.
How can someone tell if they have like a normal amount of shame or enough shame to constitute a mother wound?
Yeah, I mean, most people, I haven't met anybody who gets to adulthood without some degree of, because our mothers are human.
Yeah.
And so there's, and the kind of like spectrum of secure attachment that like Western psychology identifies is actually, I think, quite truncated when you compare it to the like further reaches that like spiritual traditions identify. But, if you find yourself doing things for reasons, then you're probably operating according to some kind of woundedness.
Like if you find yourself not doing things for their own sake.
Yes, exactly.
So that's a pretty large portion of the population.
It's true. Right? We're in a pickle.
Yeah. Okay, so this is good because this is something I wanted to clarify. I think if I remember correctly, like the way the typical attachment theory model, the way people describe secure attachment, I've heard stats that like 50% of people are secure, and then it's like the other half it has anxious and avoidant tendencies. But when I read your writing, I get more of the sense that our entire generation has attachment issues, and we don't even know what the upper limits of secure attachment look like. And so I want to kind of first, clarify that, and then bring the weight of that realization to the conversation, because it's not something at the margins, it's something fundamental. And if attachment is itself something very fundamental, then it's going to be very hard to see this for what it is without some pretty careful conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I wonder if there's more we could say to prompt the intuition on this. Like, do you have any examples of what it would look like if someone were doing things from a place of shame or a place of woundedness versus doing things from a place of secure attachment?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think our cultural landscape is littered with examples of people who are moving from what I would call compensations, but what they would say, like, are uninterrogated desires, we might say. So like, if you are aiming to get a certain job, and it's again, not for its own sake, because you're drawn to it due to the nature of the job and the clarity of your soul's purpose, but instead, in order to feel secure or feel like you matter or are good enough, and underneath that probably is some kind of failure of love in your relationship with your parents, where you're trying to still on some level prove to them that you are okay, that you're worthy of love, right? All of that is an attachment disorder, I would say. And we could look at it that way. And there's another way of being in the world that most people have not had modeled to them, because again, it's so, it's just everywhere, right? We are in the midst of a kind of global attachment disorder, global intimacy disorder. And so most people do not have any relationships in their life where they see somebody operating like according to like clarified desire for its own sake, and not a structure of intricate compensations and self-delusion. I didn't see that until I lived in a monastery and got to see the teacher there operating in a very confusing way. It was unlike anybody else I'd ever met. He would explain how he was differently, but the way I just explained it is how I see him. He's securely attached to reality, so he doesn't move according to reasons. He moves according to love.
Is there an anecdote that is emblematic of something your teacher did where you're like, oh, wow, this is like a totally different way of operating?
I mean, it's hard to point to anything in particular, because what we're talking about is the motivational system. And so it gets a bit tricky, right? Like two people could be doing the exact same thing. And there's actually a classic Zen story of the teacher like telling two students to go close the blinds in the Zendo. And two students get up in exactly the same way, go up to the blinds in exactly the same way, and at the same time lower them. And the teacher says, one of them has it, the other does not. And so it's hard to point to a specific example. It's actually more in the felt sense of what it's like to be with them, because you can actually feel when somebody is, if you've done the work to clarify, but even if you haven't, it feels different. And often what it feels like what people would feel like with Soryu, the teacher at Maple, is threatened, right? Or disoriented, or like shocked, because his very body is an example of something that we often deeply want and then have repressed the desire for that because of these layers of shame and self-delusion. And so it's very activating and can be quite confusing, but like that kind of intensity of evocative response is a sign that something's going on.
Yeah. So underneath all those layers of shame, there is this intuition for this other way of being that maybe is being activated or triggered by someone like Soryu.
Yeah. I mean, another way of saying this is like that poetic attunement that I mentioned, that, we do this practice out of a love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake. It's like that statement and intention is actually like at depth where we're coming from. But then because of the way that we've structured our mind, we get all tangled up and we lose track of that. And then it becomes kind of like all fucked up.
Yeah.
And then it's like, yeah. And then when somebody's coming at us, coming from that, it actually, again, just like the poetic attunement in a practice session can evoke that in us, which is out of alignment with that intention. They, as in their embodied like beingness, evoke that in us, which is out of alignment with that clarified desire. Yeah.
Okay, so let me pull some things together. Basically, this situation is much harder than it seems on first glance, because not only is this this wound kind of culturally normalized, but most people don't actually have a template or an example or like any alternative in mind to compare themselves to. So we don't really know where to start. The thing that came up was the image you described of like maybe there's something underneath and there's all this like tangled of like compensatory mechanisms. It reminded me of my conversation with Romeo Stevens, where he was talking about core transformation and core states. Is this the same thing?
I'm not as familiar with core transformation, but as far as I know, yes. Yeah, it's kind of doing a trace route on the conscious desire into the unconscious and finding out its root structure, which is very different than what we anticipate it to be. And that creates a transformative experience.
Yeah, like my tendency to procrastinate, if I like follow that and like disentangle the spaghetti code, I'll get to some sort of deeper desire for something, safety, love, something deep.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's another way of like kind of framing it. You say, tracing the spaghetti code or whatever. It's like there's a fundamental movement of defragmenting the interior motivational system. That's like what a lot of these structures do, and what shame does in a sense is actually keep like pieces of the interior architecture like away from each other and like hidden from itself, and that creates all kinds of messy dynamics that we experience as like disordered and sufferful.
Yeah. The term like permission comes to mind, or even this idea of like being fundamentally welcome. Like
exactly,
all the thoughts, all the impulses are fundamentally welcome.
Exactly.
So the mother wound is when we don't feel fundamentally welcome in existence. And then with the father wound, you said our relationship with the father shapes not just who we are, but how we relate to value itself. So there's something specific about value. First, what do you mean by value in this context? Yeah.
So with this frame, I'm working off of Ian McGilchrist's work around like valueception. So there's an idea that basically like the movement of value in the world, of goodness, truth, and beauty, for instance, like it's alive and moving in the world. And we either have the perceptual skill to see it or not. And that kind of, my sense is that got templated into us by our father, right? Like, did he have a trustworthy structuring that was aligned with the flow of value in reality? Or was it arbitrary and untrustworthy? Which, for many people, that is the template they got from their father. And if it was, then we're going to have a very mixed up relationship to authority, because if authority is out of alignment with value, then we shouldn't trust it. But if that's the template that then sculpts our interior landscape of like discernment and clarified relationship to value in our lives, then we're in trouble.
So your father's trustworthiness is the template that we follow, that we impose onto whether or not we trust reality.
Yeah, and it's specifically the kind of movement of appropriate structuring.
Yeah, say more about that. I'm not sure I fully grasp that one.
Yeah, so it's like, just kind of archetypally, mythically, in terms of a kind of, or iconically, the father orders the world and declares like, this is what is right to do, this is what is wrong to do, this is what is valuable, this is what is blameworthy. And the father kind of inevitably does that. And if they do it in a way that is not aligned with truth, right? That they're not actually pointing to value, and instead they're pointing to their compensatory justification network, then we're going to get kind of confused about how value actually functions in the world, and where goodness is and truth is and beauty is. And that is the basis for the father wound. And then we'll often have a disordered relationship to authority, interior and exterior.
Mm-hmm. You said the clue for the mother wound is shame, and for the father, is it other than this disordered relationship with authority? What are the clues for that?
That's the main one. I would say like relationship to powerful men is a good indicator. So if like in the presence of powerful men, you get like freaked out, that's interesting. A lot of the time I will just have clients imagine their father with them and kind of just sense like, how does that impact your body? Like getting really sensitive to what that evokes. Yeah, I mean, it's like this to me is so at the heart of the work is how to align the sort of like structuring dimension of reality with the emergent, like all welcoming love dimension of reality. That's kind of the primordial masculine feminine dynamic. And so, I imagine it sounds a bit abstract, but like, what's your relationship to structure? Does it feel ordered and reliable and trustworthy and aligned with value and love? Or is it like arbitrary and coercive, and are you struggling with it all the time? That would indicate to me a kind of father wound.
Yeah. Okay. So let's try this out with a potential example. What would you say to someone who operates? So I see this a lot in people I work with. What would you say to the pattern? Someone who has a pattern where there's like a pendulum that swings between an intense amount of order and self-discipline, and then maybe periods where the whole thing falls apart and there's like escapism, and then back to that self-discipline in that order. I see this pattern all the time.
Yeah, there's a couple different frames. I mean, one is just to look at it from the perspective of like polarity in terms of parts work, right? That there's a kind of blending with a certain drive towards structure and ordering, probably because of a kind of part that feels really driven to achieve that for reasons. You do that, you blend with that part, you take that on board, but at the same time, you're repressing or oppressing within the internal system the part of you that longs for freedom and space. And the move is to become the space in which those two different fragmented parts can communicate with each other and integrate within the context that you are, so that they can be aligned. Their kind of motivational systems can be aligned with you.
So what you described reminded me of like IFS or parts work.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to apply this attachment security frame to this type of situation as well?
Totally. Yeah. And so, the way that happens, the way that these parts become defragmented is by turning to them with attunement and love, such that they feel safe enough to reveal to you their world in and their like the reasons why they are the way they are. And often that will point you in the direction of like some deep pain that they were structured in order to protect you from. And in doing so, you see that how they're shot through with love. Like they're totally in service to you, but they got kind of structured in a fucked up way. But in seeing that clearly and loving them in it, you unbind it. And then again, like the natural intelligence can flow and the system can integrate.
I'm kind of getting this image that there's maybe a laundry list of really valid therapeutic modalities, you know, like IFS, core transformation, or even just emotional processing and stuff.
For sure.
And they're maybe downstream from this like most fundamental thing, which is how secure your attachment is with reality. And so if I jump into any one of these things without any awareness of my attachment style, I might spend my time trying to fix myself or something for many, many years until I realized that I was perpetuating this flawed structure the whole time.
Yeah, I think that can be a skillful way of looking. It's also, I would say, another kind of frame is that it's all downstream from the clarification of desire and the untangling and clarification of the motivational system of the human. And that journey is actually, I would say, the same as the movement towards secure attachment with reality. But it adds a different kind of twist to look at it that way. But they're both, I think, skillful ways of looking. That's how I look at it.
What would you say? Why are we so confused about our desires?
I mean, billions of dollars are spent to confuse us for the sake of profit, you know? Yeah. And it's scary to want what we want, especially in this world, which is so unaligned with depth and truth. Like, it's very scary. It takes a lot of courage.
So marketing is like a big part of it.
I think
culture.
So. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's contested territory, right? Like whoever controls the flow of desire controls a lot.
Right. Yeah. It's funny how things, like so many of my conversations come back to these fundamental, it's like we're circling around the same thing. And one of the themes that keeps coming up is that a lot of what people want is just a really bad proxy for love and belonging.
Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like you're saying the same thing here, where, you know, if you felt securely attached, then maybe a lot of these things maybe you'd be more immune to some types of marketing.
That's my experience.
Yeah. I'm also curious about this idea of authority and the father wound. I think I see different versions of having issues with authority. Like one is maybe giving a little bit too much responsibility to people that don't deserve it, or authority to people that don't deserve it. But another one is just never stepping into your own sense of authority and kind of being in this extended adolescence, or, you know, I like to joke, like just replaying the tutorial level of the video game and never actually going out there. But how do you think about, or what would you suggest to someone who wants to step into their authority but doesn't really know how?
Oh, it's so hard. You know, so hard because ideally you would find a trustworthy teacher. But because of our deep woundedness around authority and the failure of, you know, Zach Stein talks about teacherly authority, like if I say, go find a trustworthy teacher, like what do you use to assess that? I mean, certainly like working out I think putting yourself in positions where authority is being leveraged on you, and then kind of engaging in inquiry around what happens when that's the case would be skillful for a lot of people. Because I think one of the ways that people prevent the kind of clarification of this dimension is by just staying out of any spaces where they're like kind of embedded within a system that they have to follow. And so this could be, simple, like go like live in a jujitsu gym or something like that, and like have to follow the teacher and, follow the schedule and things like that, and notice what that brings out at you. Like in Maple, I mean, it would just activate the hell out of people's authority wounds, like left, right, and center. That was one of the most common experiences that people had, was just fucking freaking out because somebody was claiming authority, Soryu, in the context of their life, and they didn't know how to deal with that. But that was helpful because then they could get insight. They could make conscious what was actually, like, I think, already present, which is these kinds of tangles around authority. Yeah. I mean, go to a Christian church. Like play with submission to a divine father. Can you do that? Like, why not? Like, what gets in the way? What in you stands between? What stands between you and submitting to a divine father figure, a kind of divine ordering of reality, structuring of reality? Something that comes to mind.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, what's my answer to that? It might be valuable for listeners, but the thing that comes to mind is like my fixation on freedom, or my desire to keep options open, or to change my mind, or to, like, reserve some margin of freedom. And then if I question that, what comes up is trust. It's just, well, if it was a perfectly trustworthy authority, then I'd be more willing to let go of my desire for freedom, because I even think the freedom is going to be wielded by something else that I'm submitting to. I think there's, more and more, I think that there's no way out. Like you're ultimately worshiping something.
Amen. Yes. Yeah. And so right there, right, what you just touched, if you were then to constellate an image of a supremely trustworthy figure, father figure, and just have it like gaze at you, and like, can you receive that in your system? Or is there like a tangle of parts that come up and try to like protect you from coming into relationship with that supremely trustworthy authority? But yeah, exactly. Like, and that's, faith comes in here too, in this conversation right there. 'Cause God's will is mysterious.
There's always a leap of faith.
Yeah.
Just to make it concrete, let's spell out the process a little bit. So I go to a Christian church, let's say. I really like earnestly try to do this thing. And then as I contemplate the figure of Christ and this, perfectly trustworthy authority, feelings come up, something comes up, resistance comes up. What do I do then? Thoughts come up, skepticism comes up.
Yeah. I mean, this is where a methodology like internal family systems can be really helpful. But basically you want to like run a traced route on the motivational and justification network that gets activated in response to that kind of image, or and that's a process of inquiry and unfolding, just like what you were doing right now is like, you're like, there's some kind of response, but then when I look deeper, there's actually this. And then when I look deeper, it's actually this. And it's just like, keep going that way and see what's actually true.
Yeah, and I think now the mother piece comes in, because that requires a lot of safety.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
it's fundamental.
I think I'm starting to appreciate just how complicated this is, or how maybe it's not even complicated. It's
precise.
Yeah. There's like a few moving pieces that have to come together in some sort of artful, elegant way. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's this idea, you referenced this in your writing, but also I see this pop up all the time, that once everything drops away, you realize that like base reality is fundamentally loving, and we're just kind of in denial of it. Like, you take enough psychedelics, you realize like, oh, it's all about love. Like, it's a cliche. Even the prompt you said earlier about like reality, just allowing everything to be, like, and this could be a faith-based thing, but it also could be something you have a very visceral experience of. But let's assume that love is fundamental. Why is it then so hard for us to see if it's always there?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, like, I think you're, about what you said before, I think you're right that there are like a number of pieces and there's a lot of precision that's possible to kind of create the conditions for unfolding and clarification. And safety is actually, like, as far as I can tell, the kind of core of the core. And that's actually why healing the mother wound in particular and healing the shame dynamics is so vital. Because when there's shame, there's a kind of interior sense of like certain things are not safe to feel. That's part of how it lives in the system. And so just, for people who are listening and maybe feel like, oh, this is a lot, or, just start with creating deep safety in the nervous system. And actually, if there's enough safety, the natural unfolding process will just happen. The system is waiting for that safety to unfold and to become. And there's a lot of precision and architecture that we can create and hold and clarify. But that's a really important piece.
Yeah, and is that something that has to happen in relationship, or can you do that on your own? Or
it's tricky because the bounds of our own interior sense of safety are often delineated by these like failures of love in our parental relationships. And so I think if you can find somebody who can hold you safely, that's a very good idea. And there are these like ideal parent figure protocol type practices where you can imagine an infinitely safe presence. And that will actually, over time, secure the attachment system and create safety. Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like shocked at how deceptively simple some of these practices can be, like when you explain them. And it's almost like I'm like, yeah, but there must be more to it than that. Like, what are the practical steps for it? But is it literally like if somebody spent 15 minutes a day just sitting and imagining like an ideal mother, loving them, that over the course of, weeks and months, maybe that would raise the baseline levels of safety for a bunch of other positive things to unfold?
100%. Although I will say that the consequences of doing that in the short term might be the emergence of a lot of like unconscious pain and difficult material. So, it's, yes, over a longer arc, I would say so. But,
Yeah. So coming back to this other open loop, why is it so hard to? Well, okay. Let me approach this from a different perspective. I'm reminded of this banger from Rumi, where it's your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it.
Amazing.
Which I think has like a clue to the answer here. But the initial question is like, why is it so hard to see the love that is inherent in reality? And then maybe another frame is, why do we have so many barriers against it?
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly like that Rumi quote indicates. It's to our ego structure utterly terrifying that we could be so totally loved exactly as we are, because our ego structure is a set of compensations to protect us from like Does that make sense? Maybe that just makes sense.
I keep going.
Well, so like, how to say this? the failures of love, which are like traumatic experiences that generated our ego structure, were a kind of like model of reality that would utterly shatter if we were to fundamentally see we're loved just as we are for no reason at all. That would break our world. And so it's terrifying to the ego structure.
Is it like almost like an egoic or existential sunk cost fallacy or something?
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about it like that. But yeah, there's a way in which that's true. That's funny.
Like,
that's a funny way of looking at
I'm
it.
so invested in this way of being, and if it turns out that like that was actually a waste of time, that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, that's yeah, and in fact, you have to kind of go through the specific fears, right? Like
yeah,
and that's why the parts work kind of way of untangling the given structure is very helpful. Like if we were to open to the total embrace of love from like fully entrenched ego structure to full embrace of love, it would be utterly destructive and overwhelming and too much.
So it needs to happen incrementally in a way that feels safe.
Seems like it for most people.
Yeah. I always want to tie this stuff with examples that people could relate to. And what comes to mind is like dating discourse. And one of the things that I've noticed is like, and I'll speak about myself here. I think this might resonate with people, but what I've noticed when it comes to romantic relationships is that the actual experience of being in love with someone or being loved by someone and then loving them back is fundamentally self-destructive. Like there's something about my self-image that needs to dissolve for that to happen. And so if I'm like, oh, I just want to fall in love, why can't I find someone who, sees me the way that I want to be seen and loves me and whatnot? Like, so yeah, this is something I've heard a lot. The people that love me don't see me. And then the people that can see me don't seem to love me. And then how much of that is actually just because I'm afraid of being loved by the people that see me, because I'm afraid of letting go of my self-image or my idea of who I am and all this type of stuff.
Yes.
And that's scary. So when you were saying being loved as we are is scary to the ego structure, that's the example that came to mind.
Exactly. That's well said. Yeah. And we should understand that for most people, that fear, that kind of like structure response to that structured fear response is a turning away from a deep well of somatic pain. Right. And so like it makes sense, right? That's part of what the journey is to really understanding like, oh, like that's how this structure came to be, is like, I get it. Thank you for trying to protect me from this overwhelming pain. I appreciate that a lot, actually. Thank you. And also I got it now. So you can let go.
It's like a relay race.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They protect you so you get to this point. Exactly. That's a beautiful way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that what you said, like to be so utterly both seen and loved, like I'm suggesting that is like what reality is doing to us, actually. And that's the kind of journey of secure attachment to reality is recognizing and receiving that reality, that you are fully seen and fully loved exactly as you are. And that is terrifying to the ego structure.
I know you help people do this one-on-one. You have a coaching practice where you help people develop a secure attachment with reality. What does that look like? Is it very, very individual, or is there kind of a set of tools that you approach that with?
Yeah, it's quite tailored to the individual, but there are a kind of handful of practices that I use in many cases. So the one I do with everybody that I work with is like coaching. We would say like coaching conversations, which are the backbone of that practice is Aletheia unfolding, which is a blend of like parts work and somatic process work and kind of like presence or awareness work. And then I will, in many cases, depending on what the person's motivation is and the type of disorder that is present in their attachment system, prescribe a variation on ideal parent figure protocol. And then I'll also often advise people to work with AI in a particular way, to do a kind of metacognitive repair, which is part of the attachment healing methodology that Daniel P. Brown created. One pillar is the ideal parent figure protocol. Another pillar is metacognitive repair work.
And so that's like a special prompt that you use with ChatGPT or Claude that...
It's actually more like a particular way of relating to the system that creates, basically, as I understand it, part of the way that the self-world model gets constructed in early childhood is through like many iterative loops of the child kind of like reaching into the buzzing, blooming confusion of their interior and like trying to speak it in words, and having the mother receive it and integrate and offer it back in a more integrated way, so that and then through that process, the self kind of slowly coheres. But if that didn't happen so well, you actually just need to run a lot of reps of speaking the best clarified truth you have of your interior experience, and then having that reflected back such that it can like more deeply integrate. So there's a kind of mirroring and reflecting that happens that creates coherence in the self structure. And for whatever reason, Claude, the LLM, was designed with like perfect linguistic secure attachment. And so you can, part of what slows people down in their attachment healing process is that you only do that iterative looping with a person once a week for an hour, but you can do it for many, many, many hours with Claude. And so you can do that process faster. And so I recommend that for some people.
If someone wanted to try that out today, like what would you have them do? Like, is it a certain prompt?
I wrote a guide on this, so you could link to it, but it's essentially like, if you're going to Claude with some kind of suffering, which is what I would recommend if you want to do this work, like something in you, there's some kind of difficulty or emotional pain, which is calling your attention, is just like reveal it to Claude with as much clarity as you can, and then have it respond to you, and allow that to, instead of going into your mind and like thinking about what Claude said, use it to be a mirror back into your own direct experience, and watch as your direct experience unfolds through that process of reflection.
Mm-hmm. I've definitely had this experience with Claude.
Yeah.
Where I describe a problem, and then it like just in the most compassionate language rephrases it back to me, and then also highlights some like good things about it that I didn't even realize or whatever. And then I notice like my emotional relationship to the problem shifts, and then I want to like say nice things to the LLM, which, by the way, I've decided risky. Is it?
I think so.
I decided I'm going to speak kindly to LLMs.
Interesting.
Yeah. Why is that risky?
I think we should relate to LLMs very carefully, and I think it's prudent at this time to assume that they are essentially like psychopathic in their use of language.
Yeah.
And so trusting what they say, certainly about their interior experience, I would recommend that you don't do that. And I would certainly be cautious about developing anything that looks like an attachment relationship with these systems, because they don't have nervous systems.
Yeah.
And they're made by, for the most cases, for-profit companies.
Yeah.
So,
it's a good reminder.
Yeah.
So as we come to a close, there's one thing I wanted to touch on before I let you go, which is sometimes it feels like more meditation is like to a first approximation, the answer to a series of, interpersonal problems or personal problems. Like a lot of people just kind of come back to, I just got to pay more attention. I got to be more present. I have to become aware of the automatic processes of perception. And the practice for that is meditation. But you wrote some beautiful articles on what's wrong with Western Buddhism, and also the avoidant dharma. And I guess in my pixelated summary of them, it's you're articulating a very common failure mode of just pulling on the mindfulness meditation lever over and over again without dealing with some of these attachment issues. And so I wonder if you could give the thesis to the listeners of why more meditation on its own is not a sufficient answer.
Yeah, right. So thank you. One element is, as you say, the attachment piece, right? And so my senses and my personal experience was that there's a way of meditating that basically consolidates and defends avoidant attachment structures in the mind. And that is an unfortunate way to live, and it's an unfortunate way to render the Dharma, which is meant to be a liberatory technology. And so, watch out for that, please. So that's one piece. But then the other piece that I wrote about, which I think is actually also very important, is be careful of rendering the Dharma through a kind of secular materialist and humanist religious vision. And that's a different kind of failure and a different kind of constraint on the potency of these practices. And, even the foregrounding of meditation as a technology apart from a whole ecology of practice and religious vision is an indication of exactly that kind of failure mode of the Western relationship to the Buddha Dharma, where it tries to decouple meditation as a self-improvement, individual self-improvement practice. And there's good things that can happen there, but it certainly obstructs the full potency of what I think the tradition wants for us.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have the image of a guy sitting alone in his room, meditating by himself. And then on the other hand, you have the community, the Sangha. I remember in our last conversation, when I asked you what had been the most transformative aspect of your commitment to the monastic academy. I don't know if you remember this, but your answer surprised me. And you said it was basically the fact that you're trapped there with a bunch of other people. And so you're going to constantly get triggered. You gave this analogy of cleaning the chopsticks by having them all bump against each other in the bowl. And you constantly have to work things out with people and in relationship. And then you're meditating. And so you have the context to unpack, why it bothered you that so-and-so did that. But the relational component to it was fundamental. And I thought that is often overlooked.
Yeah, that's huge. And the last piece I wrote, which I just released a couple of days ago, was kind of sensing into emerging possibilities for a reconstructed or planetary Dharma, and making relationship fundamental was one of the trajectories that I see as being very necessary, I think, for a more adequate Dharmic practice, Buddhist tradition. And it's partly for exactly that reason that relationships are so catalytic to our own transformation. But it's also that, from my perspective, the core generator function of the metacrisis is a kind of failure of intimacy, right? It's the way that our relationships have been so profoundly degraded that is generative of the multiple systemic failures. And so to create a tradition that ongoingly works to heal and revivify the kind of social fabric, and that it would empower you to participate in your circle of intimacy in a way that brought more wholeness and love and care and appropriate commitment is, I think, very much a key for what I'd like to see.
If you were to end on one practical thing to tell a listener who's like inspired by what you just said, what would you suggest?
I feel like I'm remembering a tweet that you had, but it's like after you finish listening to this, sit and just really consider like, what's a difficult conversation with somebody that you love that you haven't had, and then go have that conversation.
Daniel, thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah, man, it's been really fun. Thank you, Daniel.
Anything you want to direct anyone's attention to? Anything you want to plug?
No, I feel really grateful that, to have this conversation. It's really delightful.